Hello, today I'm with Luis Castellví Laukamp. He's my friend working on Spanish and Latin American colonial literature. And I'm the equivalent, but in art history. I work on Spanish and colonial Latin American art. And today we thought we would have a discussion about his book, Baroque Ekphrasis, Góngora, Camargo and Sor Juana, and discuss how the visual element is prevalent in his analysis of their works and how ekphrasis is a key term in his book. I, for example, am delighted to participate in this dialogue because I've worked a lot on colonial Latin American art. And at the moment, I'm a Curatorial Fellow at the Meadows Museum. And I would like to introduce Luis Castellví Laukamp. He's currently a lecturer in Spanish Cultural Studies at the University of Manchester. He previously taught as an affiliated lecturer at the University of Cambridge and was a Humboldt postdoctoral scholar at Heidelberg University. His teaching and research interests range widely, but mainly focus on the literatures and cultures of early modern Spain, Latin America, and the Philippines. Central to his academic work are the theories and practices of poetic influence, imitation and transmission of culture in the early modern Hispanic world. And as I mentioned, he's the author of the recently published Baroque Ekphrasis, Góngora, Camargo and Sor Juana. His articles have been published in Bulletin of Hispanic Studies, Hispanic Research Journal, Bulletin of Spanish Studies, and Colonial Latin American Review. So now, without further ado, I would like to ask him my first question, connecting his book to the visual elements we've been discussing. I was wondering, can you start by elaborating on the relation between the three writers chosen, ekphrasis and art, and why these authors are more than others during the Baroque period had a strong visual element in their work?
Well, thank you so much, Akemi. First of all, let me thank you for reading my book and for preparing the questions. I'm also very happy to have this conversation with you. Well, Gngora was my starting point when I arrived at Cambridge. And you know, this poet had a superb descriptive talent, and he excelled in providing pictorial visions of food, artifacts, landscapes, still lifes, and also scenes of hunting and fishing. No, it's a very important part of his poetics. And I think that one finding or a discovery after reading Gngora was that it's not that he describes works of art necessarily, but rather that he describes nature as if it were a work of art. No, so it's he deploys a highly artificial language in order to represent nature as art, and that's one of the lessons. That's one of the findings that his followers on the other side of the Atlantic applied to their literature. No, so initially the project was just going to be focused on Gngora, but then I found out that there were. Well, Gngora, as you know, is the leading Baroque poet in 17th century Spain. But then I found out that he was also a model for key Latin American poets writing in the colonial period in the 17th century. You know? So I spent a lot of time reading everyone who had been influenced by Gngora in the Americas in the 17th century. And I reached the conclusion that Camargo and Sor Juana were the strongest. No, I mean, I wanted to work on strong poets who were profoundly influenced by Gngora, but also who deserved to be something more than mere footnotes to Gngora. No, poets in their own right, and they were also extremely interested in the visual arts, and I can talk more about that later. And therefore, that's what I thought. Well, this is the perfect corpus. No, like three authors. All of them have like a common poetics, but they are also all of them interested in visual poetry, in descriptive poetry. No? So that was the leitmotif from the beginning to the end.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that answer. And yes, connecting to that, I'm very interested in the in the book cover especially. I was wondering if you could comment on your choice of the feather painting of the Mass of St. Gregory from Auch, and how it encapsulates your idea of borrowed and reinvented ideas across the Atlantic. This is one of my interests, how these exchanges happen and what elements, for example, in the Auch painting represent this exoticness, both subject-wise and materially.
Yeah, thank you, Akemi. Well, this is the book cover that we hadn't shared so far, and then yeah, this is the feather work. This is a painting. Let's see this. I think this image has a higher quality. This is a work of art which is rare and of rich aesthetic value, and that has been preserved. It's currently in France, and more particularly in the Musée des Amériques. It's called the Mass of St. Gregory. It's a feather work tapestry from 1539, so 22 years before the birth of Góngora. And it's a feather mosaic that represents Christ as a man of sorrows, no, appearing to the Pope Gregory I while he was saying Mass. So as you know very well, Akemi, as an art historian of the colonial Latin America, feather work was a specific indigenous technique that was cultivated by the Aztecs, but also in Peru and other places in pre-contact Americas. My understanding is that they didn't kill the birds, right? They had like farms with birds, and they took the feathers that they needed to produce these tapestries, but they didn't kill them, no? And this is one of the most prominent examples of this art form that was sadly lost a few decades after the conquest. And I thought it was a very interesting work of art, and that really represented one of the key ideas of my book, in the sense that this work of art shares common ground with the poems of the colonial Latin American poets that I have studied. Because, well, all these works, the tapestry and the poems, were crafted in the Americas, but they follow European models, and they target not only their immediate audience, but also that of Europe. In terms of the content, also these, even though they are inspired in European models, all of these works of art or literary works, they have some elements that reflect the American reality, no, where they were produced, both in terms of the iconography, like you can see here, these pineapples, for instance, but also in terms of the technique in which they are produced, no, because of course this technique of producing a tapestry with feathers of birds was not known to Europeans, no. In the case of the authors that I have studied, Camargo, who's a Jesuit from New Granada, colonial Colombia, and Sor Juana, a nun from Mexico. Well, they follow a European model, which was Gngora. This tapestry is inspired in a Dutch print model, which was a common practice in the colonial period. But then the point I'm making in my book is that, I mean, this Camargo and Sor Juana are always presented as Góngorese poets, but they are much more than that. No, in a way, they are like a summa of all the heritage of Western literature and art in the late 17th century. No, in the sense that if you read them carefully and study their sources, you will see that they were very versed in all the Spanish Golden Age literature beyond Góngora, within and beyond Góngora, but also in Italian literature. I devote a whole chapter to the influence of an important Baroque poet in Camargo, and of course all the classics of ancient Greece and Rome. So you have all that summa in the poetry of these authors, and something similar happens with works of art like this one in particular, no? And the notion of that these works were transnational or global is also important, no? Produced in the Americas, but they aim at a European audience, and I think that is very important. No, as I said, this tapestry was a gift for the Pope, even though it never reached him. And the poems of Camargo and Sor Juana, they were all published in Spain, no, and they circulated within the transatlantic, and in the case of Sor Juana, trans-Pacific Hispanic wall. And I think that is important as well. No, we're talking of global works produced in the Americas. They printed and published in Spain, and then that circulated throughout the Hispanic world. So yeah, these are some of the points I wanted to make. This is the parallel between, I mean, I develop it in more detail in my book, but maybe this is enough for the moment. Although I wanted to highlight, maybe we have all these elements here, these little items like the 3 nails. We talk about the nails later, probably, or the coins of Judas, or these are all like little images that represent, they allude to specific moments in the Passion of Christ, no? And I would argue this is some kind of a mnemonic technique, no? Like the art of memory of ancient rhetoric, no? That just with one image, with one icon, the idea is that will awaken your memory. You will remember the episode that it's referring to, and that there's something similar that especially Sor Juana does in her poem. I argue in the chapter number 5 of my book that she also engages with this ancient practice of the art of memory. No? So here you have another example of the parallel between the visual arts and the poem.
Wonderful. Yes, no, I really liked when you pointed out the pineapples. I was wondering if you could elaborate, for example, in how maybe Sor Juana and Camargo introduce or don't introduce local features into their writings. No? If there were, for example, with Sor Juana, any pre-Columbian references, or with Camargo, any indications of local indigenous people or fruits, animals, some exotic touches, let's say.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I would say that there's a very clear difference between Camargo and Sor Juana, in the sense that Camargo is a Jesuit who had received a very Western education. And he was, I mean, the most important work he authored was this epic poem about the life of Ignatius Loyola, the founder of the Jesuit order. So even though he was a Creole, white Spaniard born in the Americas, 95% of his literary output takes place in Europe. And it's a Europe that he didn't know personally because he was never there. So just from his readings, he has to describe all the cities that Ignatius Loyola visited. And he was a pilgrim. He traveled widely. He went to Rome. He went to Venice. And Camargo has the challenge that he has to describe all these European cities that he doesn't know to a European audience who do know, these people in Europe do know the cities that he's describing. No? But it's his attitude to the Native American world is quite dismissive, I would say. Like in his epic poem to Ignatius Loyola, he only mentions on 1 or 2 occasions in passing Native Americans, and he's very dismissive about them, or he engages in typical topoi of exoticism, describing feathers or gold or wealth, but he's really not very interested in their world. And unlike Sor Juana did include, particularly, I think the most relevant aspect in this respect in Sor Juana is that she did write some lines in Nahuatl, the language of the Aztecs. No, she has some villancicos that include lines in Nahuatl, and she did show some interest. And there's even, like in one of her theater plays, there's like a prologue in which she elaborates on a parallel between the sacrament of the Eucharist in the Catholic Mass, and the human sacrifices in the Aztec world. No, so she did engage much more deeply with Native American cultures than Camargo did.
Oh, fascinating. This is an aspect that's really interesting, having this balance now of one that really strives to be to emulate Europe and reach Europe, whereas the other one is more of a mixture, no, Sor Juana. So it's interesting how the balance is portrayed, no? Yes, wonderful. So I thought now that we could go focus on Góngora for a bit, and whether you can discuss Góngora's presence in the Spanish court and how much access he had to the royal collections. Perhaps you can also discuss Velázquez's portrait of him, if you can show us an image of it.
Sure, sure. Here you have the image. This is a painting produced in Madrid at the court in 1622, probably at the request of Francisco Pacheco. So as you know, Velázquez began his career at the studio of Pacheco, who was a painter and writer, and eventually Velázquez married Pacheco's daughter, Juana. No? So Pacheco became his father-in-law, and we will talk more about Pacheco later because he also produced a book on art theory, which was very relevant very influential in the 17th century. So it's probable that Pacheco asked Velázquez to produce this portrait, no? Although its early history is not established in detail. This painting is currently, I saw it in Boston, actually, in the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, even though it was next to the stairs or something, like not in a very prominent place. I was a bit disappointed by that, because I think even though Velázquez was only 23 years old when he produced this portrait, this is a very early, very young Velázquez who's producing this portrait, and of a very mature Góngora, on the other hand. Like Góngora here, he would die 5 years after this portrait was made. He had already written his most important works, and he was a mature poet. No? So we have the young, promising artist on the one hand, and the mature poet on the other, who's the subject of the portrait. And I think that Velázquez's abilities as a portraitist can already be appreciated in this early painting. No, I mean, this is a very incisive psychological study where we can feel like this kind of, you know, Góngora had a very disappointing experience at the court in Madrid, and he became very embittered and very disillusioned after spending some time in Madrid, and he ended up returning to his native Cordoba in the south of Spain. So I think you can, I mean, look at, if we zoom in, look, for instance, at this downturned mouth, the guarded gaze. I mean, he does look like a man who doesn't trust people easily, no? And I think that Velázquez was very, very perceptive in this respect. And we are so lucky to have this painting, because we don't have paintings of Camargo and paintings of Sor Juana. They were all posthumous, but it's very likely that Góngora was actually sitting for Velázquez for the production of this portrait. As for Góngora's access to galleries, I'm not sure about royal collections. I do know that he had access to private collections, like of some of his patrons, aristocrats, wealthy people living in Madrid, and not just in Madrid. No? So there were people, some of his patrons, like the Duke of Lerma or the Cardinal Archbishop of Toledo. They were great collectors of art, and we know that Góngora had access to their collections. No, for instance, the Cardinal Archbishop of Toledo was a great collector of still life paintings, and I don't have any doubt that Góngora saw them, and that had an influence in his work. No, because one of the fascinating things of Góngora, like there are scholars Mercedes Blanco, who have argued that Góngora's works are highly visual, due in part to the incorporation of images from paintings, and Mercedes Blanco's work was very influential for my own research. No, and I think that one of the fascinating things of studying Góngora, and particularly the Soledades or Solitudes, his 1612 poem, is that some of the greatest, some of the relevant genres that appeared or that were being developed in the early modernity, like the still life or the landscape or the portrait, you see poetic equivalents of each of these genres in Góngora's poetry. You know? And that's one of the reasons why I thought that he was definitely worth studying from this viewpoint of the relationship between the so-called sister arts.
Fascinating, no, and I really appreciated those passages where you compared Patinir's paintings to his writings, and I find it quite interesting how there's like such an interest in landscapes, still lifes, and landscapes especially weren't, let's say, they don't have such a tradition as they had in the Netherlands and up north, no? But of course there was a circulation, no, of Flemish works to Spain and even to the New World. So that's an interesting connection, no?
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, this is a painting that we hadn't prepared it for the talk, but I'm very happy to, since you mentioned it, I'm very happy to share it. Can you see the painting of Patineer now? Or not yet?
Not yet.
Wait a second.
Just,
I will stop sharing yeah, here we go. This is the painting by Patineer that you mentioned, a very early example of landscape art. Let me see, I think I have the data. Yeah, this was produced, Landscape with Saint Jerome. This was produced in 1516, 1517, and it was acquired by the Spanish monarchs, and it's today preserved in the Museo Nacional del Prado. No? So this is a painting that it's very likely that Góngora had access to this painting, for instance. And there are key passages in his poem in which he describes like a landscape seen from a cliff, no, with a certain perspective. And I do think that actually that landscape is very similar to what we see in this painting by Patineer here, with the only exception of the human presence of the saint, of course. No, so this is just another example of that very enriching dialogue between painting and poetry.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Sorry, I wanted you to talk about landscapes as well briefly. So I thought now that we've introduced Góngora and his interest in still lifes, landscapes, we could move on now to Camargo. Your following two chapters deal with Camargo. And I was wondering, I was especially enraptured by his description of Ignatius of Loyola's Crucifix, and how perhaps this relates or differs from Francisco Pacheco's description of the crucifixion with 4 nails in his 17th century art treatise, El Arte de la Pintura. And I was wondering if you could also comment on how there was a greater emphasis on describing and representing bloody Christ in the Americas.
Yeah, thank you, Akemi. Let me try to move to the next. You're seeing Góngora now?
Yes, I am.
Okay, let me stop sharing, and because for some reason it didn't move into the next picture. Just 1 second. Just 1 second. Okay, here we go. The next painting. Yeah, so this is the image of the crucifixion that I wanted to share with you now. So this is an example of those bloody crucifixes that appeared in colonial Latin America. You see it now, Akemi, don't you?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
So this is it's called Crucificado del Santo Hermano Pedro. This was produced in 1657 by Pedro de la Rosa in Guatemala. No? And another image that I will comment to answer your question is this splendid Jesús del Gran Poder by Juan de Mesa, which is from 1620. This is preserved in Seville in South Spain. So basically, Francisco Pacheco, in his influential book that I mentioned earlier, the Arte de la Pintura, he gives very explicit guidelines, very clear guidelines of how Christ on the cross should be represented. No? So for instance, there was, even though 4 nails were more common in early Christian art, the number of 3 became mainstream. And in fact, even here, you can see 3 nails, right? Representing the 1 for each hand and then 1 for the feet. Now, Francisco Pacheco reacted very strongly against this tradition, and he argued in his book that the so-called Cristo de Cuatro Clavos, or 4-nail Christ, was more historically accurate. No? And he had a huge influence. Like there are paintings by Zurbarán or by Velázquez in Spain that follow that lesson, and even in the Americas as well. No, and the other aspect that Pacheco wrote about was about the crown of thorns. No, so he said that, well, the crown of thorns didn't only surround the temples as it's ordinarily painted, but it covered the whole head. No, so it was something bigger, like almost like a helmet crown, no? And I think in this work of art in Seville, you can see very clearly that they are following that kind of guideline. Now, that's something, it's not just Pacheco. I mean, if you look at other, especially Italian authors like the Cardinal Paleotti, he also wrote along these lines. The idea was that there should be an emphasis on the suffering of Christ. No, Christ cannot be just represented just with a white, spotless body. No, the blood needs to be added, because that suffering has to be emphasized. No. And then, well, the fascinating thing about Camargo is that he, in his description, there's a whole canto about Ignatius Loyola living as a hermit in the cave of Manresa, close to Barcelona in 1522, and he's carrying the crucifix, and there are several lines devoted to describe that crucifix, and they follow very strictly all the rules that have been established by Pacheco and other authors. No, so the Christ of Camargo has 4 nails. It has a very big and painful crown of thorns, which is piercing the head of the Christ. And there's also a very long description about the blood which is flowing from the body. No? Emil Cioran, the Romanian philosopher, he authored a book about saints when he was in his early 20s. And he coined this expression of the voluptuousness of suffering. No? So this idea of, in Spanish, you would say regodeo del sufrimiento, no? This emphasis, which is almost like find certain enjoyment almost in this kind of emphasis on the blood and on the suffering. And Camargo participates in that tradition. It's not just a Baroque tradition. I think you find it in the Middle Ages as well, with the so-called Crucifixi dolorosi. No? But certainly in the Baroque, they carried on that tradition. And something I found fascinating is that, well, in the poem by Camargo, he exaggerates so much that he, even at some point, Ignatius of Loyola is shocked looking at those at that crucifix and all the blood. And in this sense, I want to highlight also that Spanish American crucifixes, sometimes blood was added to them by later generations, because they thought that crucifixes that had been produced in the 16th century, they were not, they found them wanting in this regard. No? So the extra blood was added. And then Camargo even says in his poem that Ignatius Loyola starts flagellating himself in front of the Christ. And he punishes his body to such an extent that his blood covers the ground of the cave and overflows the cave, and then even raises the level of the nearby river. No? So it's like a complete, imagine like a river of blood overflowing the cave. And that's such a complete exaggeration. It's almost magical realism avant la lettre. And in fact, even though I didn't include this in the book, I found an article by Gabriel García Márquez from 1960 entitled La literatura colombiana, un fraude a la nación. No? So Colombian literature, a fraud to the nation. And he argues in this article that there are, in the whole history of Colombian literature, there are only 6 or 7 authors who are worth reading. And the first poet in the list is precisely Camargo. And I don't find that surprising. I don't think anyone has studied this in depth, but I do see a connection. Like, for instance, in the way blood is described in Crónica de una muerte anunciada, Chronicle of a Death Foretold, and the way blood is described in this poem. So this is something definitely which would be worth studying in more depth, the connections between the colonial Baroque and magical realism.
Wow, yes, I wasn't aware of that connection. I'll have to go back to Gabriel García Márquez and read that. Fascinating. So yes, now that we've discussed Camargo and his portrayals of the crucifixions and how he even emphasized the blood to an extent that was even not likely that verges on magical realism, I thought now we would talk on the magnificent, move on and talk about the magnificent Sor Juana, Inés de la Cruz. And I was wondering if you could comment, actually, because you mentioned briefly that they're just posthumous portrayals of her by well-known artists, Mexican artists, such as Miguel Cabrera. And also another portrait that has an inscription that mentions that she painted her initial self-portrait on which the second portrait was based. I I was also wondering, apart from these portraits, whether you could comment on how Cabrera, for example, portrayed her wearing an escudo de monja or nun shield, and why were these important, and what kind of artists would paint these?
Yeah, thank you so much, Akemi. I have brought two portraits of Sor Juana. The first portrait is probably as famous. This is attributed to Nicolás Enrique de Vargas. This is an 18th century portrait, which is currently in the Philadelphia Museum of Art. And the second portrait is the most famous portrait of Sor Juana by Miguel Cabrera from 1750. I believe it's currently held in Mexico City, although I'm not sure exactly where it is. No, both paintings are very important and interesting. For instance, if we focus on this painting by Cabrera, if we zoom in here, you will notice that there's a book here. You see my mouse, right? Arte de la Pintura. This is Pacheco's book. This is Pacheco's book.
Wow. I didn't realize that.
And there's another book here called Gloria de la Pintura. I'm not sure who the author of that book is, but we have, she's represented in her library as a scholar with at least 2 books on art, no? And then here there's the book by Kircheri. This is Athanasius Kircher, the famous German Jesuit and polymath, no? So these works of art are interesting because they tell us a lot. There's a lot of information in, for instance, in terms of what Sor Juana could have read in her mythical library. I mean, that library has been scholars have tried to reconstruct it on multiple occasions, although it's very hard because it hasn't been preserved, unlike other libraries in colonial Mexico. But my point is that I think that Sor Juana, I argue in my book, Sor Juana was very interested in the visual arts, like Camargo and Góngora. For instance, she designed the triumphal arch of Mexico City in 1680 for the arrival of the new viceroy. She authored more than a dozen poetic portraits of women, and in some poems she shows that she was very familiar with the lexicon of art, no? And the fact that even in the paintings she's represented as having important books of art just highlights or strengthens the hypothesis that she was indeed not as a polymath, the polymath that she was interested in art indeed, no? The point of whether she was an artist herself was, as you said in the previous painting. If we look at the inscription here, it says, so the painting presents itself as a copia de otra que se hizo y de su mano pintó Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, no? So this painting is presenting itself as a copy of a self-portrait by Sor Juana, which unfortunately, if it ever existed, is not extant. No work of art has ever been attributed to Sor Juana. The speculation that she painted has been addressed by, for instance, by Elizabeth Perry in an article of 2012, and she argues, or she suggests that if Sor Juana ever painted, probably her artistic output belonged to the realm of small-scale painting, miniature painting. And she elaborates on that, and she has good arguments to sustain that thesis. But again, we are in the field of speculation, of course, because we cannot be sure. But small painting, miniature painting was something similar actually to the painting, to this escudo de monja, this shield of nun, which is hanging from Sor Juana here, and also in the other painting. In fact, all the paintings of all the portraits of Sor Juana represent her with this shield. No, this, as you know, Akemi, these shields were round medallions displaying usually the image of the Virgin. The most common motif was the Immaculate Conception, and the only exception to that is Sor Juana. Sor Juana, she's always represented having the Annunciation, no, the angel Gabriel announcing to the Virgin Mary that she will conceive and that child will be Jesus. That's always the motif in Sor Juana's paintings. Maybe it's even more clear in the other. I think it's more clear here in this painting. No, so it was always, Sor Juana was always represented like this, and you would think that maybe this was an element that would emphasize her devotion because in this painting, for instance, she's much more a nun than a scholar, no? Whereas in the painting by Miranda, with that impressive library in the background, she's more of a scholar than a nun. But actually, even these medallions were controversial in the sense that there were some bishops and archbishops in Mexico who argued that they were too lavish. Some of these medallions were produced by the best artists in colonial Mexico. So certain bishops thought that it was just too much for a nun to wear works of art of this quality and this value. No? And as you know, Sor Juana had to struggle all her life because there were people who thought that a nun should back then in 17th century Mexico should devote her whole life to God and not to literary creation. No? So that those tensions were a constant in her life. And even though my book is not biographical, when you study Sor Juana, it's very difficult to avoid that, no? Because unlike Góngora, whose life was almost, very little happened in the life of Góngora, and we know very little about the life of Camargo. But in the case of Sor Juana, we know much more, no? And we know of these struggles that she had to, these obstacles that she had to face as a female writer, trying to find her place in a very masculine and patriarchal society of letters, no, of humanities. So I think this point of the medallion is relevant in this respect, and it enriches all these discussions surrounding the tensions in Sor Juana's life.
Fascinating. No, I didn't know. That's interesting about the triumphal arches, no, because these were also let's say, very intricate and sometimes included hieroglyphs, allusions to Roman emperors. No, they're very complex iconographically. So it would have kind of suited her writings that are also very eloquent and very much referential of classical texts and Kircher and these kind of hieroglyphic kind of complex structures. And then it's interesting to hear as well about the miniatures. That would make sense because several female artists really specialized in this more so than oil on canvas, no? So those are very interesting hypotheses with the miniatures. And I was also wondering, yes, and the nun shields were certainly painted by some of the most renowned Mexican artists and were painted on tortoiseshell quite often, which is another quite exotic and expensive material, no? So that might have also sparked the anger of those that were saying that there was too much luxury in these cells, no? These nun cells, which normally counted with several servants. They were enormous. They were like cities, no? So there was a lot of luxury, you know? But I must say that without all this knowledge, without this incredible library, we wouldn't have Sor Juana as she has come down to us. So we're very fortunate that she had access to all of this, no? And that she was so eloquent and protective of the education of women, no? From one generation to another, which is fascinating. So yes, thank you so much for this wonderful discussion. It's been very enlightening to hear about Góngora, Camargo and Sor Juana and how they relate to each other and how Ekphrasis is key to their works, no? And I really enjoyed it, especially in terms of the visual elements. I wish more books would do so and focus on including artworks that could have inspired writers because they're very much intertwined, especially in the case of these three authors. And I really hope many of you go and read Luis Castellví Laukamp's book now that we have had this wonderful discussion and discover more of the wonders, especially both in terms of literature and art, no? That are connected, no, to these three key authors. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Akemi. It has been a pleasure talking with you about the book. Thank you.